Welcome to the Troubled Artists Podcast, Episode 15, Neil Laird.
Welcome back to the Troubled Artists Podcast. Today I am here with Neil Laird. Neil Laird is an LGBTQIA plus and multiple Emmy-nominated director for historical films on Discovery, BBC, PBS, History Channel, National Geographic, and many other networks. He has produced over 100 programs around the globe that feature crumbling Egyptian tombs, lost Mayan cities, and mysterious shipwrecks at the bottom of the sea, and currently has a book out on Amazon called Primetime Traveler Series. So thank you again, Neil Laird, for being on the show. So before we begin, I do like to ask this question. So just tell us in your own words, who is Neil Laird?
I know you ask that to all your guests, and I'm sure they all say the same thing, but that's difficult because, of course, there's a lot of things that go into, I guess, what I do and what impels me. But I suppose storyteller is too banal, but I would say close. I'm a chronicler, maybe just a bard, since I love my history. I just love telling stories, particularly ones that are either rooted in the past or somehow inspired by history. I'm enamored of history, but at the end of the day, I'm not bright enough to be an archaeologist or an anthropologist, so I tell stories about them instead. And that pretty much has impelled my entire career.
Nice, nice. That's great to hear. Yeah, it is really interesting, just like the whole historical context that you have for your films and that you have so many shows on like these big networks. So it is really cool to see that. I am curious to know just like how you got into uh, doing what you do. Is it like something that started like early on in your life or something that you found later on in life?
I've always loved stories, as I just mentioned, but I always thought when I was a kid watching all those late night movies on TV that I would do fiction. I very much wanted to be a filmmaker, and I was really inspired by those great historical epics like Lawrence of Arabia or Seven Samurai, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. All these ones that kind of made a hyper real experience of the past. And so I always thought that I would pack it off and go to, Hollywood and try my hand at that. And I went to school for that. And then after I got my bachelor's of arts degree, I thought nothing's going to stop me from being Martin Scorsese overnight now. So I went to New York City expecting the phones to ring, and it didn't. And the only time I did get a phone call was for some crappy horror film as the guy who holds the walkie-talkie at 4 in the morning to make sure they don't steal the grip truck. My first job was Toxic Avenger 2 or 3, which also dates me but shows you what modest beginnings. But I mention all that because clearly I became fairly disillusioned very early on. I mean, you got to pay your dues, so I was expecting it. But I had so much free time between jobs and very little money to spend, if any, that I was in New York City, so I started hanging out at the New York Public Library because it was air conditioned and free, and this is the day before cell phones, so I'll just go there, then come back and check my phone to see if anybody had called, and they usually hadn't. So I started pulling all these books out of off the shelf, and for whatever reason, one day I pulled a book off the shelf about the rise of civilization, about the rise of Neolithic culture, things that I never got in my small Catholic school back in Pittsburgh. You just didn't learn history. And a penny dropped. I became absolutely fascinated by this rise of culture that I just didn't know anything about, particularly how they started early civilizations along the Mesopotamia and Egypt and all those places. So I resolved to teach myself history through the New York Public Library. It didn't cost anything, right? I could sit there until they threw me out. And when I got to Egypt in particular, I really got stuck. I became so absolutely enamored of Egyptian civilization that I could think of nothing else but just imagining what it was like and clambering over the ruins and seeing the pyramids. So that's exactly what I did. I got enough money from a few crap jobs and I went east and I backpacked over the Middle East for 8 or 9 months. I went to started in Egypt, of course, which was life changing, and then went to Israel, Jordan, Syria, Iran, Turkey. And I came back with my head in the clouds, just loving these cultures, and asked myself, how on earth can I make this a career? How can I do my love of filmmaking and storytelling, but then get someone to pay me to go to Damascus and Cairo instead of on my cheap student visa? And then documentary seemed to be the way. So I went back to grad school and got my master's in documentary. And because of people I had known in Egypt, and the Antiquities Board, I made my thesis film about the Great Sphinx of Egypt. They were restoring it at the time, very badly. It had been restored in the past and falling apart. they realize the error of their ways. I think the Sphinx is a very, very fragile. It's cut into the living rock right there in the Giza Plateau. But when you see photos of it, you don't realize that it's one piece of rock, except for cladding stones that are put around it, going all the way back to antiquity. And these cladding stones invariably fall off the Sphinx. So in the 80s, the Egyptian government hired a bunch of Italian brickmakers or somebody who was ill suited to the job to come and patch up those cladding stones. And they used modern day cement, and the rocks were too heavy, the boulders were too heavy. So almost like the Sphinx shedding an unwanted skin, it all just kind of fell off, and the Sphinx was a mess. And they're about to do this restoration and put it back, and hopefully using the old method. So they got all these local stonemasons from the poorest part of East Cairo. And that's where I came in, because the context I had. I said, this is a brilliant idea for a film. So I went over there with student film gear. I made it my thesis film. Didn't tell them I was taking the gear out of the country, mind you. You're not allowed to take it out of Chicago. I took it to the Sahara. Got a lot of sand in it. And then I made this film. I followed the stonemasons around, and I made this film, and I was able to sell it to Discovery Channel, which is pretty impressive for a 23-year-old kid with absolutely no resume, except for Toxic Avenger 3.
Right.
And then suddenly I was off and running. I was very fortunate that taking that chance and borrowing, money from my wonderful uncle who never asked for it back. I was able to pull off this film, and I've been doing that ever since. So that was 1997, and I've pretty much been making those kind of films for the last nearly 30 years.
Wow. Wow, that's really cool. Like just like how you were able to get started and like how it all started from like a library, just like seeing like books about that. It's really cool just to hear people's stories like that, like their humble beginnings and just like how they started. And some people find that early on in life or later on in life. And it is really cool that, yeah, just at 23 you were able to have a show like air on the Discovery Channel. I mean, that's very impressive.
It was obviously wonderful because it allowed me to jump over several steps. I never had to be an associate producer or go through all the pitching process. And mind you, I have since. Obviously, it's ups and downs. Not every film I have done since then, mind you, has been quite as inspiring and quite as rewarding as Saving the Sphinx. In fact, after 1,000 hours of television, over 120 programs, there are many that I wish were not on my IMDb page. They ain't all ones to celebrate. But I've been a working documentary nonfiction filmmaker ever since, and particularly with a slant towards, again, history, archaeology, particularly ancient history. And I'm a great traveler too. I've been to 70 odd countries, both for shoots and for films. So I have a real great love and understanding and affection and contacts in that part of the world, which just keeps sending me back and sending me back. Which really, so basically, picking up that book at the New York Public Library in I don't know when that was, 89 or whatever, changed my life.
Yeah, that's really great. Just being able to do what you love and, just traveling around the world, it's great that, you're able to do what you love and just to see the world around you. It is very, very, very cool to see. Um, I want to get into like some of the questions that I sent to you earlier. One of them in particular was, how do historical secrets help motivate your storytelling across media?
The secrets is a tricky question because help me define in your mind what an historical secret would be.
I guess just overall, just like just your historical, just like your findings, like everything from your like what you've done and all the history that you've found, just overall, like how it helps your storytelling across media.
Well, one thing in television, if you've watched any of my shows, and they're all over Discovery, National Geographic, PBS, the way we make shows, particularly in the US, the UK is a bit different, but we always need a mystery. It can't just be, here's a history of the Bronze Age. It has to be, why did the Bronze Age collapse? It can't be a question about, King Tut. Here's King Tut's tomb, and here's everything in it. It has to be, who killed King Tut and why? You always need to have a central mystery that gets people to keep watching, particularly over commercial breaks and everything else. But it also is a great way to kind of tell a story in a different way. If you just tell History 101, you can read that in a book. What's great about television is it's like a film. It takes you on a journey, takes you somewhere. So you kind of have to dangle that carrot and have that mystery, or as you would call it, a secret. So, and that's tricky in television because quite often there are no secrets and they have to be fabricated. We ask questions that are very, very sort of roundabout. We already know the answers, but yet we still have to kind of create the film in a way where at the end of the day, at the end of the hour, we're revealing something. We feel like the viewer hasn't been an hour or two ago. Sometimes it can be, will we find the lost treasure here in this Mayan jungle? And usually we don't, because we're there 4 or 5 days, or it's already been found and we know we're going to find, but we create it as if, we recreate it as if we're there when they do it, which is a sleight of hand, but it's also a great storytelling device. I've come to terms with it a long time ago because I recognize that people don't necessarily come to American television for a dissertation, for understanding the immediacy of an archaeological dig or that kind of thing. They want to be transported. They want a good story, and to do that, a sense of mystery and discovery is paramount. That's what keeps people glued. So I think almost all of my stories have to have that secret that is found. But a lot of times in the last couple of years, I have transitioned into novel writing. That was a totally different process that came out of making 1,000 hours of television, having to footnote everything and having to make sure we were as much buttoned up as possible. There's a certain point where I wanted to transport people to what Egypt looked like when Ramses the Great walked it, what Pompeii was like as it erupted. And of course, you can't do that necessarily in a nonfiction film without fudging the facts or creating stuff. With fiction, it's wide open. So for me, it was a wonderful transition to take everything I knew about the ancient world and yet create a fantastical journey that can blend fantasy and nonfiction together. And I mentioned that the last book that I put out, Primetime Pompeii, and each book is a series about a film crew, not unlike the ones I've worked on, that discover a way to time travel. And it's very sort of jokey and it's sort of lightweight. And there's just two gay characters we can talk about later, which is very important to me too, to have representation is positive. But it's about them time traveling, ostensibly to win an Emmy. Let's go back and be in Pompeii, and we get this big budget. We're definitely going to win an Emmy this year when we're there. But I always want to find something that's not only a mystery or a secret of the past that we find in the museums, but also in my 3 books, something that deals with LGBTQ issues too. And the hook that made me come up with Primetime Pompeii, Central Mystery, was: have you been to Pompeii? Have you
Uh,
seen the ruins?
I have not been to Pompeii, but I have traveled to places like London or but yeah, no, I haven't been to
Yeah.
Pompeii yet.
Put Pompeii on your list because you can really. It doesn't take much to imagine what
Yeah, I'll definitely
it
put
looked
that.
like then. And of course, for those who don't know the details, in 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupted, and within a couple hours, the entire city was covered in ash, and not only preserved the city as it was in Roman times, but also stopped people dead in their tracks and burned people so quickly with the ash that later on archaeologists could put cement into the hollow and then cut it out and actually get plaster casts of these people's last moment. And there's one that's always, when you go into Pompeii today, you go into the main gate, the amphitheater gate, and you'll see a bunch of these plaster casts behind glass. And there's one that's always been very, very controversial, contentious, because you can't really tell what the moment is. You can only imagine it. My documentaries, I could talk about, here's what we know about it, but I couldn't go that step further, which I do in the book. And the plaster cast are of 2 people holding each other tight at that last moment when the pyroclastic flow finally caught up with them. And it's clear they're holding each other. They're bracing for their death, their impact. They're in this thing called the cryptoporticus, which is Latin for just a covered causeway. So they're probably trying to get to the Bay of Naples and trying to get out, and they didn't make it. But for long times when they pulled it up, because it's more plaster than it is human being, you really can't see too much on the outside. They called it the maiden and her daughter. They thought it was a mother holding her daughter very, very tight because it just looked like that's, pure love. And it wasn't until 4 or 5 years ago where they were able to open up the plaster cast and find some DNA and bones. They discovered a couple very interesting things. One was they're both men. Also, they were both between 30 and 35 years old, and they were not related, which there goes mother and child. But it also opened up the question for many people, could these have been a gay couple? Could this have been a same-sex couple? Now, we can't tell behavior after 2,000 years. And certainly in my documentaries, I could ask the question, but not take it a step further. But now that I'm writing novels based on this experience I have, I went there. And I created the story of these 2 gay men who lived in Pompeii, and it's their story and how they got there. And my film crew goes back and interviews them and gets the story, and then takes it back to modern day the modern day world and lets them live again. So I mention that because it's a great way to kind of blend my two disciplines, fiction and nonfiction, yet still wrapped up with my love of history and my love of storytelling, and still making sure the facts are verified, but also letting you know when you read my books that I'm having fun with them for the first time.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I am curious, yeah, just like if you could talk more about like those primetime traveler series, which are currently on Amazon right now. Just like what was like sort of the main inspiration behind that?
Again, I think I got to a certain point where, and I'm still in television, still love it. It's still my bread and butter, and I'm, developing a project right now for the BBC on the Valley of the Kings. Fingers crossed. So there's still very much my key discipline. But about 10 years ago, I started having an itch to tell different stories in a different way. I've clambered over so many sun-bleached ruins that I can look at and say, oh, here's where the chariots came, and this is definitely where, King Prime could have stand at Troy of X. But anyone looks at it, it's just a blob. It's just a mess of hills and nothing. You cannot really be transported. And I really want to tell stories where not only just took people to the ruins, but I took them to what Troy looked like when it was at its peak, when there was a Greek army down below and there was 10,000 people fighting it. And I wanted to take my love of the history and bring it to uh, new viewers, that passion. And of course, what I realized very early on when I started writing was, boy, it's a rough transition. Just because I've made hundreds and hundreds of hours of nonfiction scripts does not mean I instantly become a novelist overnight. It was a total different language, and it really took a long time for me to understand I wasn't writing a screenplay. I was writing something literary with an internal dialogue, internal voice. I needed to find that voice, the Neil Laird voice. It can't be distant. And it took me 4 or 5 drafts and lots of rejects from agents who said, maybe you should sell this as a film. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to write a book. So it was actually another book that I wrote that all took place in ancient Egypt, and that was the feedback I was getting. And an editor friend says, well, Neil, you have this other fascinating day job, which you've been talking about. Blend those two together. What makes you unique? Everyone can write about Pompeii or Troy or the Valley of the Kings, but you also have this experience of being there as a filmmaker, being there when a tomb is opened for the first time in 3,000 years, being able to climb up on top of the Sphinx's head and see things the tourists can't. Use those experiences. And so I thought that was liberating, because then I realized, oh, then fantasy is the way to go. Time travel fantasy, which is something that I never dabbled in before because I was Mr. Realism, bedrock reality. So once I hit on this idea of the Primetime Travelers, which is a 4-person crew, and the first book, Primetime Travelers, are in ancient Egypt, interviewing some crazy woman for a paranormal archaeology show, like an Ancient Aliens-like show, really down and dirty, cheap show. Woman claims she was reincarnated from ancient times, and here we go, it's episode 37 of this shite TV show, and yet Jared, the young director who is now heading up his first show in the field, very much like I was back in the day, through machinations you'll have to read the book to find out, and this reincarnated woman, a portal to the past is open, and they're able to step back. As long as they do something for her, she will open a portal to the past and allow them to go back to ancient times and shoot anything they want, as long as they get out by sundown or sunrise, because they have to basically travel the 12 gates of the underworld, the Duat, and look for a missing mummy that she's lost. But if you don't get out when the sun rises over the Nile, you're stuck there forever. So there's your hook. But now I allow this film crew, this very jokey, very modern day film crew, to go in the past and to blend that with what I know about Egyptian mythology. And it was great fun to write because you have the cheesy host who knows nothing about archaeology. You have the tough lesbian camera woman who is, wants to ride roughshod over everybody. Jared, the young host, is very afraid. He comes out in the first book, confronts the homophobic host. So I brought these other elements of myself, and then I put it into an adventure romp that's more Indiana Jones and graphic novel in a way than it is history. Yet anything you can read in there, I can guarantee, has been verified. So the second book is Pompeii, and the third book I'm writing now, Primetime Troy, which I'm in the middle of, they go back to the ancient battlefield of Troy in the Bronze Age, meet Achilles, Agamemnon, Prime, all those people, and they kind of fuck with history there. That's the headline for all of them, messing up history, one episode at a time.
Wow, that is really cool. Just like the well, first like the idea of blending like real life history with time travel, and like you said, like you never dealt in like that realm before of like sci-fi or time travel or anything, but challenging yourself to sort of blend that together and then creating this, really cool like sci-fi Indiana Jones type thing and putting in like your real life experiences. It sounds very, very interesting, and I'll definitely uh go on Amazon and pick up a copy myself of all of, well, the Pompeii one, and then I'm just interested and wish you luck on this Troy one that you're writing. They all sound really, really interesting, and
Thank you.
definitely will be checking that out. Um, what have been like, I know we've talked about like your stuff about how your show was on Discovery and BBC, but what have also been some of like the major highlights of your career as a documentary filmmaker?
I mean, it's tricky. I could tell you the wonderful, I could tell you the good, the bad, and the ugly. There are times where I was there when saw things that no one else could see. I've been arrested a few times, for shooting in the wrong place. I've gotten dysentery in 4 or 5 countries. But I would say, accentuating the most wonderful. Probably was on one of my early shows. It was another Egypt show. It wasn't the Sphinx, but while we were shooting there, in the Giza Plateau, where the pyramids are, we were called down to the side of the hill by the archaeologist we had been interviewing, but he had to go back to his day job. And he says, "Oh my God, we just found a tomb. We just found an entire cemetery we didn't know existed." What they had discovered was the necropolis of the people who built the Sphinx and the pyramids. And people never really knew anything about them. They either assumed they were slaves, they think they disappeared from history. But here is this tomb at the foothill of the Sphinx and the pyramids for the workers, which tells a few things. One is that they were venerated, not venerated, they were valued enough that they actually got to be buried near this holy place. So they weren't cast off slaves. So you look at their bodies and they're all bent up and they're all hunched and they're very modest. They weren't mummified. Mummification was for the rich. But the experience that I had that is unlike any other, and this shows you the privilege of being a filmmaker and being at the right place at the right time, was they opened one of these tombs in front of us. And they're beehive tombs. They're not like the Valley of the Kings tombs that go deep into the bedrock. They're made of mud brick, and they were covered, and that's why they survived. And they opened one of these modest tombs. And as they did, we had our camera there, we were poking in. This hot air came roaring past us. Hot air that was 4,500 years old, that was last breathed by high priests in 2,500 BC, rushed past us. And over the years, I think I probably made it more than it is, but I almost feel like I remember it singeing my eyebrows. It was so hot. But it was this idea that we are basically the first people to see something that has been hermetically sealed for 4.5 millennia. And then as we looked in and the light and the dust settled, we could see again a very modest male in a fetal position, and around him a few funerary pots, a thing called canopic jars, where they put the organs into. And these were unadorned. The king tuts are beautifully made of alabaster, and they're ornately carved. These were unmarked, simple, everyday pots, clay pots, all totally intact. However, each one was absolutely pristine, again as the way it had been set down by priest so many thousands of years earlier. But to remind you of what archaeology really does, that at the end of the day is more about destruction, as much about destruction as about discovery, is we got pulled away for a few minutes so archaeologists could do their thing. And then as we were outside and we came back 5 minutes later and got our cameras in there, all those pots had cracked. They had already snapped because the modern air hit them, the modern day, and they were already dissolving and falling apart. So there was this thing that was totally pristine for thousands of years. And we came in and although we're trying to preserve the past, every time we turn over a spade and find something else, we also recognizing we're aiding to its destruction. So that gave me a very bittersweet understanding of being there at a moment and seeing something that was so privileged, but also recognizing the responsibility and the importance of getting it right and making sure you preserve it and record it, because what we had on tape was the only image that exists of those pots in situ.
Yeah, that is really cool. I mean, I think that's also just the beauty of documentary filmmaking is sometimes you can like you have to expect the unexpected because there's so much stuff that happens and like in real life, that can just see and it can just go away like that, and if you capture it on film, it's there forever.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of that, I think. And like, especially like, I know, like when you're doing like, say, narrative filmmaking, there's a lot of stuff that has to be, fabricated or stuff, to help tell a story, but with documentary, it's all real. It's all there. The history, the facts of it, and just being able to capture something that no one has seen in, thousands and thousands of years, and now it can be shown like forever. That's really
Yeah, it's a
fascinating.
wonderful responsibility. And again, I can't pretend that we're the ones that recorded. The archaeologists do all the work. We happen to be there then. They're the ones, of course, they're the ones that finding these things. It was happenstance that we were on site. With any kind of document, it doesn't have to be a document about the ancient past. It can be about something that happened recently, whether it's a protest documentary or, a friend of mine just made the Katrina documentary, and going back there and getting people to sit there and talk about what it was like 20 years ago, being the chronicler again and recording that stuff before it's all gone. That's what nonfiction can do.
Yeah,
And that's one of the things that still makes me love it so much, is that no matter what I watch, if you trust the filmmakers, they're going to record something and tell you a part of the story that you may never otherwise never know.
exactly. Yeah. And that's the beauty of just what artists do in general. They show this sort of perspective that people may have never seen before, this sort of, and not just film, but also like artwork, or a writing, a novel. It can show them this story and like a perspective that people may have never thought of before, or maybe had taken for granted, but can see there's so much more to it. So it's really cool that we have this sort of career just to like sort of shift people's perspective and just sort of just be our creative selves. It is very fascinating to do that. And again, I do wish you continued success on your documentary filmmaking journey, because it sounds like it's very, very cool. But I was curious to know, just like what challenges have you faced doing historical documentary filmmaking?
One, I think, is what I mentioned, is a trick of telling the story straight, because a lot of people, obviously, we're in an age now where fact becomes fiction and everything else, where fact doesn't matter anymore, and that's a very deeper problem with the Ancient Alien show and also the kind of politics we're living under. Um, so I really kind of make those what they call factual documentaries. I don't do reality TV. Others do that much better. The kind of more blue chip docs are the ones that I've been fortunate enough to make. But I think it's so easy to get the facts wrong or to go for sensationalism. Sticking to the facts when they're less interesting is tough, particularly if nothing happens, and not fudging it. In the age of AI, in the age of giving the people what you think they want, it's very, very enticing and tantalizing to fudge things. I've been doing this for 30 odd years, so, I'm an old guy now in this business, and I do worry that some of that veracity may be going the wayside. Coupled with that is, very sadly, the business is dying. What I do is a dying business because the networks are disappearing. I was for Science Channel for 12 years, which is a smaller Discovery Channel owned by Discovery, but it was all science, archaeology, space, and engineering was our bread and butter. That's gone. They pulled the plug on that a year or two ago, and I was an executive producer there for a long time, overseeing hundreds of hours. And they just closed the network along with Animal Planet and Smithsonian Channel. So all these smaller networks are gone because streaming is riding roughshod over everything. And what streaming means is, if you go to HBO Max, where all the Discovery what survives of HBO or Discovery, because it's now part of HBO and Warner Brothers, is a much smaller slice than what it used to be. So they don't need as many hours. So I know dozens, maybe hundreds of people who are out of work here and in the UK. I work with a lot of British production companies too, and both sides of the Atlantic are really hurting because there's just not any need for that anymore. If you go and look on Netflix tonight, you may find one or two documentaries about the past. A friend of mine did a wonderful one on Saqqara a year or two ago, the necropolis outside of Cairo, which is still on. If you go to HBO Max, you see a bunch of my shows, but they're 7 or 8 years old. What they're doing, what sells now is crime and biography and those kind of things. And the shows that I grew up making and loving and bringing to the world, the travel, archaeology, adventure stuff, that sort of inner Indiana Jones, they're being phased out. They're expensive to make. They always were more niche, which means less people watch them. They'll watch a crime documentary or a bio on Pee Wee Herman or whatever. So they're not funding them. So the sad thing is the business is changing so exponentially that what I am doing is almost a dying business.
Mm. Yeah, no, I could definitely see that, and I know what you mean. Like when I see like the rise of like like these crime and documentaries and stuff, because I've definitely seen a bunch of those on HBO Max. But I feel like I guess there is this sort of good and bad side of streaming, and how it sort of took away like a lot of the content that you used to see in the past. And then you also mentioned AI and how that's growing. It's yeah, I mean, the world is changing, and it's
Yeah, and it's
all
not all for the worse. I mean, certainly streaming is a reason. It's not like streaming isn't being forced on people. People are choosing, and I understand the joy of streaming. It's one-stop shopping. It's all there in one place. Why spend $120 for a cable package where it's all crap? And I understand, not all, obviously, but a lot of it. I understand the appeal of the streamers. And I'm talking from an insider perspective, those of us who have made it our career for so long, that traditional television is going through major, major changes and won't be the same again. So I was fortunate to come in when I did. I know one of your questions you asked me is what I would suggest to young people.
yeah,
Like,
your
well,
advice.
you know, if you want to get into nonfiction, then forget about sending your treatments and your proposals to Discovery or BBC or Nat Geo. They're not buying, or they're already going to work with the people they already know. It's those streamers like YouTube, and it's those the places. Think more modestly. Think smaller budgets. Think 10 minutes versus an hour, and find a way to build your audience there through social media. Exactly what you're doing, podcast. That's one thing I've been doing with my books. One of the ways I've been selling my books is I have a small videos that I put on Instagram and elsewhere, TikTok, about ancient gay history. And some are just 2 minutes long. It's about Hadrian, or it's about Achilles, or it's about gay samurai. And I just tell, just me talking with a little AI in the background, and I tell histories about forgotten gay history. And that really has helped sort of build my awareness of who I am, but also send people to my books and things like that. And it's a lot of bloody work, and there's no money in it when you start. But for someone who's coming up as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, certainly if you can get into a History Channel show or a Discovery show, then certainly say yes. But know that the days are numbered for that kind of shows, and you should really be looking at the new generation, which any 20-year-old already knows is going to be streamers. You don't need an old guy in the 50s like me to tell you that. But I will tell you that any any tips that I can tell you on how I got in the business are totally moot now, because between 1995 and 2025 is a different world.
Yeah. No, I mean, I understand that, but I still feel like, it is important, to see, shows and like about like history and, it is still very entertaining, like, and obviously, like you said, the world has changed and, they're not sort of following that format how it was in the past, but it is still very cool, just like still being able to just do what you love, and even though the times are changing, still being able to go back or even just trying to adapt to like this sort of new form of media that we have, like how you said, mentioning, using TikTok, to help tell these stories about forgotten gay history and using even AI to help further tell like that story, So, it's all of like these tools that we have at our disposal, and I mean, it's so much easier nowadays, because everyone has like a phone and social media, so it's
Mhm.
very easy to get our content out there in the world than it was, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, and I don't want to
Yeah.
badmouth what's happening today. It's not like I don't want to be the old Luddite saying times are better then and they shouldn't do that. Clearly, people have been telling stories forever. The story of the Trojan War is not going to end. Homer wrote it 1000 BC and we're still talking about it. I know that Chris Nolan is making a big budget film about the Odyssey that comes out next year. So these chestnut stories are evergreen. So Egypt and Rome and Greece and the places that I travel, they're not going to go away, but the stories are going to change. And that's where I have to recognize and bow my head to the new generation of storytellers who use a different medium and a different method than I did. It doesn't mean that one necessarily is better than the other. Probably an 18-year-old kid would much rather watch, a series of 4-minute videos on Egyptian mythology than even read my book, perhaps, if they're not reading literature, or certainly not watch a 5-part BBC series on mythology, because this is too much investment. It's not how they want their stories divvied up for them. It's totally valid. I cannot, you cannot dismiss anybody's storytelling. I remember when I was a young kid and, I was addicted to television, as most kids in the 70s and 80s were. And I'd be sitting here watching all manner of shit on TV. My dad would come in and say, this is terrible. You should go to the movie theater and watch Ben-Hur or whatever. You want to see classic. Well, I was a little kid and I was happy watching a Brady Bunch episode at 4:30 in the afternoon because that was the stories were being told us. For better or worse, that helps inform the way we tell stories. In fact, I remember my father yelling at me one time saying, turn that TV off. Career spending all that time watching TV. I still remind him when I go home, that house in Brooklyn? I bought that on television. So I did turn TV into a career, Dad. But again, television versus film versus podcast, everything else, these are all forms of storytelling that we have to embrace. It's much better to embrace them and understand them, or step aside if you don't believe in them, than to try to stop them, or to try to badmouth them, or try to say that they're not valid. Because every story is valid if well told.
Yeah, definitely. And I think people's definitely their sort of perspectives have changed throughout the years, or people's attention span, like you mentioned, like TikTok, or just like people are more adapting to watching, say, something that's like 30 seconds to like a minute, as opposed to, like you said, a whole 5-part series, about history, when they can learn it in just like a minute or about that particular part. But I feel like, yeah, sometimes it is important for artists like us to adapt to like these sort of new changes, or finding these new ways of media to help tell our stories, so there is sort of that stuff that we love, and just sort of adapting it to like these new forms of technology, how you mentioned with podcasting, or or just social media in general,
just telling stories in a different way. I've been between shows, I've been doing a lot of cruise lectures, which is something I didn't think would pop up. But, I get on a cruise and I talk about the behind-the-scenes stories of television, or how I changed careers in my 50s, or history. If we're going to the Rock of Gibraltar, I would tell stories from the field, or some great stuff about the Rock of Gibraltar. And it's been great fun because it's another way of reaching out. I recognize that's storytelling as well as telling a documentary, whatever, because it's a way of connecting with people and getting them excited. It doesn't have to be razzle-dazzle. It's just getting people, transporting people. And that's as simple as it goes, standing on a stage and talking to people. That goes back to Homer. It's just all oral. So have to recognize that storytelling isn't just one path. There's many ways to be creative and many ways to inspire and to tantalize and to get people excited about something. And that could be standing on a Holland America cruise ship, or that can be doing a big budget $3 million documentary for PBS. They both have a place.
Yeah. Yeah, it all just goes down to just what it is that you're trying to say, what's the story, and there's
And your audience.
And the audience.
And your audience.
There's just so much, there's so many ways that we can help tell a story and inform people about it, and like you said, it doesn't have to be this sort of big, $1 million thing, it can be just as simple as, two people talking with a camera recording, so that people can listen in and just hear what they have to say. So yeah, I mean, I feel like that's just sort of like the bottom line of what we are as artists, like how we should tell our stories, because at the end of the day, we're just doing what we love, and we're gonna find ways to adapt to these sort of new changes that are happening, every day, and I'm sure, 20, 30 years from now, there'll be some other new form of technology, and, it's not going to stop us from telling our stories and doing what we love. We're just going to find ways, to adapt to it. And
each person is different. I have a newsletter that I put out, just one came out yesterday, and it's about me killing off a character, one of my favorite characters. I had a couple thousand people on it, and I always make sure that when people reach out about it, they reach out and say, oh, I think this is the character that died, or I like what you said about this. And many of these, of course, are strangers, people I picked up through my books or newsletter swaps or whatever. But I recognize that a lot of what you need to do in this age is the one-on-one. And, one woman was talking yesterday about this last thing, like, I don't think you should kill this character because this, and this. And this was a woman in Australia that I never met, but clearly read both of my books. And it was wonderful to have that dialogue with her. And, I know that she's a fan now and she's looking forward to the next one, but it's also too, everybody has to wants to hear a story differently. And a newsletter and the way we are now is wonderful for that because all of these people can reach out to you directly. I get a pool out, I say, which character do you think will die? Or where should I go next in my books? And, I get some wonderful responses. And then I always make sure I respond to those people and talk to them because whatever brought them to the books is different. And I love hearing from those people. And that's something you couldn't do earlier when you didn't have that direct connection with the creative person. So I really enjoy that part of the process.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, it's also just really important, I feel, to listen to your audience and what they have to say because they're part of us, like we can't, do our work without like the people that watch it, like because they're
Yep.
the ones and the sort of word of mouth, like, oh, you need to check out this person's, documentary films or this person's artwork, and check out their website, so it's all that sort of word of mouth and they help
And now
sort
you
of.
could do it directly. In the old days, with my television show, I couldn't do that. I put a show on the air and I get the overnight rating and say, oh, it did well in Wisconsin, but we bombed in California, whatever. And that's as far as I knew about who was watching, what they were thinking. But with social media, particularly with the books and with the outreach, and I have my website, neollaird.com, you can sign up for the newsletter. What's great about that is, again, it's like I'm now able to see and hear from the people that are looking at my work. Unlike 10 years ago, I did Shark Week for years. And we know Shark Week always rated very well for Discovery, but I have no idea if people watched it because they put it on at 8 o'clock and they left it on all night or they lost their remote control. Nobody came back and said, I love that Air Jaws you did, but better than last Air Jaws because of X, because you didn't have that dialogue. With the new world where you're talking directly to the people who watch it, it's work to respond to them all, but it's also very rewarding because now I get an idea of what's going through people's head and how they're reading, how they're watching, how they're feeling about it. Particularly the gays, the male to male, which is a category for my book on Amazon, which helped get that word out. The gay community has been so supportive, and they've put me in other newsletters and talk, and other gay writers will swap newsletters, and it's not just the audience, it's the other creatives. And that's a great plus with the digital world we're in, where I will read your LGBTQ time travel book if you read mine, and then we swap, links on our newsletter, and we get a whole new group of followers.
Yeah, it all stems back to just connecting with other people and like you said, it is so much easier nowadays with social media and just getting that sort of direct interaction. And then also, like I said, just like listening to what people have to say because some of it is positive and some of it is negative, or just like what people hope to see like in the next project, and
Yeah.
being able to take people's sort of advice and building upon like the stories that you tell, and just building better and more creative projects after that, so. And it's definitely very important, to like you said, just to listen to what people have to say and how you're able to just even talk with those people, and get their ideas. It's like I said, it's much easier nowadays than it was back then, but it is very, very important. And like you said, like the audience is just so important to have, and they help tell our stories, or just sort of like you said, sending our different links to other people, and like I said, going back to word of mouth, so overall it's just even though there are some like challenges, like you said, with like some with like streaming or even stuff with like even with AI, and so I like to think of it as just these tools that we have, at our disposal. We can't let it overtake us, like especially with AI,
You can't trust them, though. You can't. I mean, you have
Yeah.
to still make sure you, as the artist, particularly as a documentary filmmaker,
Yeah.
not just writing a History Channel script a few weeks ago for a freelance gig I was doing, and I won't get into details, but we needed an extra beat, which means one more little, one more little event. And I asked AI, I said, okay, we have this gap in the history, and there's a more modern one about modern consumer, and it was 1950s. What happened here in the 50s that we can use to connect these two dots? And AI gave me this wonderful beat, this great invention, this innovation that worked perfectly for my story. And I was rushing to get it out to the network, so I put it in there. And they reached back and they said, where'd you get this information? I can't even find an image of it. And when I back and I looked again, none of it was true. AI had created, it hallucinated, and gave me what it thought it'd want. It was so sycophantic that I knew the kind of script I was writing, and it gave me what what it thought. See, I'm already personalizing. I wanted. Absolutely, it said in 1954 they released this product, and here is the advert, but there were no footnotes, no links, because they had totally fabricated it all. And that's the danger, of course, which means you still need the human interaction. If you're making a documentary, particularly if it's fiction, then you have the problem of just making it bland and dull. I can always tell when somebody's relying more on AI than they are creative fiction. But in the world of documentary, we are all very wary of relying full time on ChatGPT because it will create BS just to please you.
Yeah, no, I could definitely see that, especially as a documentary filmmaker, so I mean, as long as you have that originality and, just listen to the facts, that's essential as a documentary filmmaker. That's what you do, yeah, like I said, there's positives and negatives of AI. I mean, I've used AI before, and
And we
to
all
help.
use it, yeah.
Yeah, it's part
It's a
of the
great tool too. Yeah, I mean, I'm not
yeah.
saying they're all just a bunch of BS. The onus is on you to say, okay, now, Mr. ChatGPT, go through this again and verify it. Give me links to everything you said here, so I can do the legwork and check it. You
Yeah.
come back and say, oh, I'm sorry, I don't have any of that. You're right. This is all BS. Or they will give you the links. So you have to use it, see it as you said, as a tool. It's not a solution. It's a tool.
Right. Yes, exactly. And it can be used like to help further tell your story, but
Yeah.
as documentaries, you said, like getting that sort of context and those links is important. But just for like just narrative storytelling or fiction storytelling,
Yeah. Well, it's a
it's
big problem in
yeah,
publishing, particularly in self-publishing, where people were just saying, okay, give me 6 series, and I create a series about, I don't know, some dystopic zombie that kills vampires or whatever. Now give me 3 more novels with the same characters. And AI can spit it out in seconds. And if you have an audience that isn't looking for anything more than a cheap thrill, that may be enough. But what that means is you're taking jobs away from the real writers, from the book designers, from the copy editors. Copy editing is already a dying business. So again, when you're on the inside, you recognize AI's growth is our misfortune if we're in that business. You have to accept it because it's not going to go away. But it's also very lowbrow sometimes. I mean, someone who's going to tell a story, Primetime Pompeii could never have been written by AI because there's too much Neil Laird in it. There's too much about my love of gay history, my being there. When you read Primetime Pompeii and you turn the corner and you go into Julia Felix's estate, I can promise you it looks that way because I've been there a dozen times and I am telling you how I thought and what it looked like. AI can't do that. And I suspect never will.
there's again, it all comes back to like the human connection and like our stories,
Yeah.
our personality. It's what makes us who we are, and AI, just a bunch of code and ones and
Yeah.
zeros, and it doesn't have like that real life human emotion to it. The human experience is the people that we interact with, like the stuff that we see every day in our lives,
It can give you the tropes. It can say, it can
exactly.
give you the key things, but it's not going to bring it to life.
Yeah, exactly. So, like I said, as long as you keep that originality and that creativity in, just who you are and telling that in your stories, that's essential, and that is so important. And, like you said, I mean, like we'll use, AI and stuff like that every now and then, just to maybe help further like explain something or
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
point out something. But like you said, at the end of the day, it's just a tool. Don't let
It's
it.
great where I really use AI a lot is for my cruise lectures because those are all verbal. So I'll say, okay, we're doing the Mediterranean now. For example, I just did a cruise from Spain to Morocco, and I did one on famous shipwrecks of the Mediterranean. So I went into AI and I said, give me 10 famous shipwrecks and verify them in bullet points. And then I took that information and I dug deeper, but I used the bullet points because it's all verbal anyways. I'm up on an audience talking about it and I know the information. But AI was quick to say, here's a Roman shipwreck, here's a Byzantine shipwreck, here's one from Crete. And they gave me that stuff second, and it saved me so much time having to go through myself. So for that kind of bullet pointing and that kind of summary, AI is so helpful. But then to get in there and to create a narrative or to create literature or to create something that's solely based on the word, you need a human brain.
Yeah, it all just stems back to how you use it, and like, yeah.
Thank you for tuning in to the Troubled Artists podcast. Have a great day.